Okay. That's here. Testing, testing. Hello. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Tsujimoto Seminar in Global Development. And I welcome everyone in the room, and I'm also acknowledge and welcome those of you who are participating in the seminar today via Zoom. It is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Lily Hsueh. Lily is an associate professor of economics and public policy at Arizona State University, where she's also a senior global futures scientist at the ASU Julianne Wrigley Global Futures Laboratory. Lily is an affiliate scholar at the Stanford Woods Institute for the Environment and the author of a book that she is going to be, that reflects the title of her seminar, and that we're actually going to auction or raffle off today during the seminar. So most of you have raffle tickets. And if you don't have a raffle ticket, after I finish this introduction, please feel free to come down and I'll hand you one. We all have a equal possibility of earning a signed copy of Lily's just hot off the press book. Very exciting. Lily has been featured, her work has been featured in the Financial Times, Fortune Magazine, PBS NewsHour, and among other media outlets. And her work on corporations at climate crossroads is the product of bringing together disciplines, multiple disciplines, and a scholarly analysis of her topic. I'm very excited to have Lily with us, and welcome. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you so much. It is such an honor to be part of the Tsujimoto Perspective in Global Development Seminar. Today, my talk is on Corporations at Climate Crossroads, a book that I just published this past month. So it does bring together multiple disciplines from economics, political science, and management. And I'm delighted that the book published by MIT Press has been endorsed by leaders within these various fields that really have shaped climate policy and governance. So as we know, 2024, so this past year was the hottest year on record, and the year before that was the hottest year on record. Here I have a graph of the difference in surface temperatures from 1880 to 2024 relative to the century average and 1901 to 2000 average. And we see that indeed it has been very, very hot. And the globe has been warming. And the share of global carbon dioxide emissions due to fossil fuels, it really is responsible by global firms representing 70% of annual industrial emissions. And about 100 producers of fossil fuels represent and are responsible for those emissions. And, juxtaposed with those physical climate development are the political economic ones. So back a couple years ago, many of you may remember, California announced its mandatory climate disclosure rules, and it's still in the works, perhaps a little delayed, but still in the works. And California was not the first place to mandate climate disclosure. We have them in the UK, the European Union, New Zealand, India, Singapore, and even cities like Hong Kong. And even the US SEC had proposed rules that unfortunately never went into effect. Well, global businesses, which I follow from 2011 to 2020, the largest companies in the world by revenue and market capitalization, they've been preparing for mandatory rules and more. setting scientific quantitative emissions targets, and even an internal price on carbon. So, and some of these global businesses include the largest agro-food buyers, such as Walmart, Nestle, and Unilever. And so Walmart, for example, when they set a 2030 target, it's going to move through the supply chain, affect suppliers and processors and then producers, and eventually have outcomes on the carbon footprints. And I wonder what evidence would convince you that buyer targets, even at the highest level, would actually have real outcomes. And so my book follows global businesses such as Walmart, Nestle, and Unilever, as well as I said, the largest global businesses in the world. And I ask these three main questions in my book. I ask, what firm level and political economy factors drive corporate behavior and performance on climate change? Do firms that participate in voluntary climate action, when they take actions proactively, in fact, emit less carbon emissions? And do firm regulation, global governance drivers vary across sectors and in developed and versus developing countries? Today, I will have an opportunity during the second part of my talk to show you and answer the questions. Do firms that participate in voluntary climate action, in fact, emit less carbon emissions? So what I will be doing is linking sustainability outputs like carbon disclosure and targets, and even internal price on carbon, and linking that to outcomes, carbon emissions and carbon emissions intensity. So first, let me begin with a big picture overview of my book. The core argument in my book is that corporations are at climate crossroads. And it's shaped by bottom-up as well as top-down incentives and pressures. And really, altogether, it's this multi-level governance framework where I am theorizing and then showing empirically this nested structure of climate change governance, and really involving the interplay of what's happening inside the firm, so firm-level decisions, regulatory pressure, as well as global norms. And I put together this, or theorize this strategic management framework, where I'm showing that managerial agency, so this idea of preferences and how that interact with structures, with climate risks at the regulation and global governance level. And that together lead companies to act on climate, even when regulations are lagging, or when regulations are forthcoming. So if there is one sentence thesis of my book, it is: to navigate uncertainty, corporate responses to the climate challenge are an interplay of the internal firm leadership, complementary business capabilities, and strategic and proactive engagement with regulatory process and global governance. In this book, I approach it through mixed methods. It involves both large quantitative analysis of Global 500, as well as S&P 500 index firms. I follow their climate mitigation, as well as performance between 2011 and 2020. I put together a global sustainable business and climate action database, where I have firm-level data from financial data on carbon disclosure, internal price on carbon, emissions intensity, measures of environmental social governance, ESG metrics, and also carbon management structures and organization designs within a firm. Whether companies have an executive level manager on climate mitigation, for example, and whether they are involved in climate or in global climate institutions or organizations. At a market sectoral level, I have data as well on natural gas prices to gauge what's happening within the market, as well as at the country level, regulatory stringency and various measures of what that means, and climate rules and laws. And in terms of my quantitative analysis, I do try to get at causal inference, linking again, which I'll show you later, sustainability outputs to outcomes. Companies are making all sorts of pledges for 2030, 2050 targets, right? But are they actually putting in effort, and do they work? And I also have attended various sustainability conferences driven by the industry and have attended UN Global Compact, SDG summits, where I talk to firms, regulation or leaders, as well as global governance leaders. In the book, notably in chapter 8 of my book, I have illustrative case studies where I am attempting to trace causal mechanisms as well. So, for example, I have these various case studies in my book. So earlier at the start of my talk, I talked about bringing together disparate literatures in economics, applied economics, political science, public policy, and management. So I draw from the applied economics literature, notably the private provision of public goods literature and the literature in public policy and voluntary programs, where I'm looking at a decentralized governance approach. Firms are profit maximizers with a broader set of attitudes, preferences, and calculations. And what I mean by that is that companies are taking into account private politics, so stakeholder climate politics that have costs, right? When activists are protesting against what's happening across the world, what companies are doing, as well as public politics, so regulations, public policies, even regulations to come. So not just those on the books, but those that are forthcoming. And firms are facing imperfect and asymmetric information, right? They don't know exactly what's happening with regulators or with stakeholders. And so that's their assumption, is that this is not a perfectly informed world. And so what they will do, especially in the midst of climate uncertainty, is that they will engage in self-regulation to deflect private and public politics, to reduce some of those costs now, and act sooner to anticipate those potential costs down the road. And then I also draw from the political science literature, notably in international political economy, international relations, about private authority. In that literature, firms have become governors. These global businesses are calling the shots at times and setting private standards, and governments across the globe have delegated their public authority to private authority to some of these companies, and companies are engaged in part of this complex and fragmented networks of actors that includes NGOs, global governance leaders, and companies and regulators, of course. And these days, there has been a lot of emphasis bring back the state, looking at what's happening domestically across the multi-level governance, from federal, kind of national level politics, all the way down to state and local politics as well. And increasingly an eye on distributive conflict lens, asset owners versus traditional fossil fuels asset owners versus green asset owners as well. What's missing, though, in this two sets of literature is the firm continues to be a black box. Are there drivers within companies itself? Are there managerial leadership or complementary capabilities that we should be taking into account? And how are they making decisions vis-a-vis regulation and global governance? And so that is essentially kind of what I do in the book, is I bring it all together and open that black box of the firm. And so in terms of opening that black box managerial agency, I contend that managers perform three important tasks. They attract climate neutral and climate conscious employees, and they align beliefs with employees and of the firm. And managerial leaders, and so these are the executive level leaders, such as sustainability officers within a company. They form governing coalitions comprised of internal stakeholders across ranks inside the company. And when they do that, they're able to facilitate incentives as well as coordination, be able to pivot and help companies pivot from complementary capabilities to climate. And I will be showing and sharing a couple of case studies where that has happened. And also they shape narratives. And increasingly, firms are carriers of identity and reputation. There are studies that show that, especially with today's employees and within today's labor market, many people, including students inside this seminar right now, where you care about what your companies represent, the companies you work for represent. And so companies are increasingly taking that into account and making sure that they confer to employees beyond just wages, but that they are also doing well on the sustainability front as well. And so here I have a graph between 2011 to 2020. Essentially, I'm showing you here senior or executive level managers responsible for climate mitigation is on steady rise. And so here we see corporations in developed countries and developing countries as well, and India and Brazil really following the trend of developed countries, above what's happening in the global South. And then here again, I show a similar graph, but now with China and Russia in the graph as well, where companies within China and Russia, both private as well as government-owned entities, where they are also installing these sustainability officers and rapidly trending up as well. So let me speak for a couple minutes on my strategic management framework, which I call multi-level governance framework on climate change in my book. So what I do is I adapt inverted Eleanor Ostrom's nested structure of institutions. So I have here at the very top, the constitutional level representing global governance and global best practices. These are norms that don't have teeth, but I argue indeed are taken into account by corporations. And at the collective choice level, regulatory governance. And then at the bottom is our operational level where corporate governance sits. And this is where internal firm organization, as well as structures and managerial agency matters. And in my book, what I do is I propose propositions where I'm linking corporations with regulation, corporations to global governance, as well as regulations and global governance interactions. And so I contend that managers are regulation brokers. They managers will help companies engage in self-regulation to safeguard firms' reputation, cultivate regulatory goodwill, and avoid costly liabilities. And managers are also norm brokers. They will help represent the firm. Sometimes they contest, shape, and translate some of these global best practices that they learn and take away from global governance institutions, such as the UN Global Compact, which is a UN-initiated kind of sustainability initiative for corporations. And global governance institutions are a harbinger of future regulation. With this all said, what is happening at the learning and norming at the global level is attenuated by regulatory pressure. So when push comes to shove, at the end of the day, regulation that's happening at the country level do call the shots, and we know this. And so there is that minor adjust. Sometimes it will lead to the learning and norming don't always move as quickly at the global governance level as we would like, because they are attenuated at the regulatory level. And so in my book, this framework is linked to what firms are doing with respect to voluntary climate action. So both with respect to their participation So their pledges and their climate disclosures, their adoption of emissions targets, internal price on carbon, and then there are varying levels of effort, or what I call intensity of participation, and I have different measures of that. It could be high level and low level. High firms engage in high effort when regulatory pressure is high. I'm controlling also for stakeholder activism and other market forces as well. And intensity of participation could be low if there's really no external pressures or leadership within the firm or managerial capabilities. And ultimately, I link participation also to performance, to emissions intensity and entity-wide carbon footprints. So this is this is my framework and how it connects to voluntary climate action. So let me briefly tell you two stories. The first one is on Adidas, a German, as you all know, Adidas has been recognized actually as a leader by the UN for measuring, reducing, and contributing to climate action. They're not perfect. There's been some questions within the kind of German legal in the German legal courts about their 2050 pledges, whether there are in fact actions behind that. That said, what I find is that Adidas is in fact a great exemplar, excuse me, of that multi-level strategic management framework that I talked about earlier. So in 2025, Adidas established its first green company. So it's an organization within the larger company itself. It has now been rebranded as Workplace and Governance, as the move have been now toward really making sure that sustainability is across the entire firm, including human resources. And so from the very beginning, Green Company was sponsored by Adidas Chief Executive Officer. So there was always that important upper node of decision making. It initially focused on energy efficiency, paper and water recycling. And then by 2015, so around the time of the Paris Agreement, it started to focus on standardization, tracking, and reporting of targets. And also within the company itself, there were green teams across all global sites where every unit had access to green funds to support sustainability projects that are even initiated by employees of all levels with attention and responsibility by higher up authorities. And at the corporate and regulatory level, so that interplay, as a German company and a EU company, Adidas have faced more regulatory pressure and real regulation than some other global businesses, and has started to report Scope 3 emissions too, as part of the EU directive on climate disclosures. And in many cases, because it's already doing what it does in the EU, that has transmitted to what it does at the local level, oftentimes exceeding local infrastructure and regulations where it operates worldwide. And starting in 2021, it has integrated its environmental reporting as part of its financial reporting. And it has this new branding that's called Own the Game. For the places we play, without a beautiful planet, there is no beautiful game. And in my conversations with corporate leaders within Adidas, there has also been a lot of interplay or interaction between them and global governance. It announced back in 2015 the fact that it was using ocean plastics to produce its shoes, and that has gotten a lot of attention and in general good attention. Adidas has been a founding member of many global governance collaborations, whether it's on sustainability or even on some human rights and responsible sourcing. So here's in my book, I feature Adidas. And I also feature Microsoft, a tech company. And Microsoft has really taken a holistic approach to climate change. It was among the first to establish an internal price on carbon under Microsoft's chief environmental strategist. And that was back in starting around 2016 to 2018. And it had used that as a tool to finance and to reduce emissions at scale and to generate funding for carbon removal efforts. And as you know, it has developed cloud-based AI-driven suites of tools to help organizations measure, manage, and reduce sustainability impacts. Of course, it has also come under fire as well for helping oil and gas producers to become even more efficient with their cloud-based AI-driven tools. And with that said, it is considered a global leader. It has consistently been on top of the U.S. EPA's it has won numerous awards for green procurement, green energy procurement, and an early joiner of RE100, which brings together a global institution that brings together companies that are interested in procuring and deploying renewable energy systems. And so again, Microsoft, like Adidas, have these managerial organizational capabilities where managers and executive leaders at the highest level are helping to deploy these various climate actions, and they're pivoting from existing capabilities, and they're interacting with regulation and with global governance. Aside from what they're doing in terms of corporate lobbying, every global business has that, but this is totally outside of that global lobbying arm. And so here you see that companies are following that strategic management framework that I theorize and speak of earlier today. I am going to now pivot a little bit, and I have shared a little bit about my theory of multi-level governance drivers of corporate self-regulation on climate change, shared a couple of case study stories. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to get into an empirical piece where I connect sustainability outputs to sustainability outcomes. And I'm going to do that within the US case, looking at regulatory pressure coming from Obama-era Clean Power Plan, and again, linking corporate climate action to corporate carbon footprints. Many of you may know the Carbon Disclosure Project, now known as the CDP. So the CDP, on behalf of nearly 800 investors worldwide, they annually survey global businesses, and these are the Global 500, the S&P 500 companies, as well as medium-sized corporations as well. And they are these annual surveys survey companies on their governance, strategy, risk management, targets, and also on their entity-wide carbon emissions. Just to step back a little bit, I just want to talk about the different Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3 emissions. Scope 1 emissions are direct greenhouse gas emissions that occur from sources that are controlled by corporations themselves. And these could be emissions that are coming from corporate-owned vehicles and from their own furnaces. Scope 2 are indirect greenhouse gas emissions are associated with, for example, purchases of energy and power. And Scope 3 emissions, for those of you who work in the supply chain areas, it's the supply chain emissions that are coming from, it could be upstream or it could be downstream as well, down to the product level. So CDP, so back to CDP, grades firms on low to high levels of carbon disclosure. And I exploit that in my empirical studies where I'm able to differentiate between companies' varying efforts of carbon disclosure. And so based on firms' disclosures. Again, as I said, firms are graded on their disclosed level of sustainability outputs and mitigation activities. So at the lowest level, companies can get a grade D, which is just response to the annual survey with some initial assessments of business impacts. It then moves to grade C, and it can get up to what CDP called the leadership level, or grade A, if it is able to show that and report that it has set an internal price on carbon, that engages in third-party audits of just scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, and at times they might even report the supply chain emissions, although that data is a little bit spotty, so I focus on scope 1 and scope 2 emissions in this book. And one thing I would point out is that for the CDP, leadership is not equivalent to environmental performance. It is all about sustainability outputs. And you're going to see how then this bears out in my analysis. So what I do is I exploit the fact in a quasi-experiment, in a kind of natural experiment, the fact that for the 2 decades before the Inflation Reduction Act of about 2022, there has been failed climate change proposals in the U.S. Congress. And so in this 2 decades era, there, in fact, actually was quite a lot of climate action, despite the fact that a lot of federal legislation failed in Congress. In the EPA, through President Obama's initiatives, was able to introduce the Clean Power Plan through a Section 111D of the Clean Air Act. And of course, the Clean Power Plan, or CPP, was boosted by the fact that the EPA was able to show that greenhouse gas emissions endanger public health, and we know the endangerment findings is currently in question. But at that time, it was a very consequential study. And the Supreme Court also was able to rule that the Clean Air Act encompasses greenhouse gas emissions. So this was a Clean Power Plan was at that time considered by both the power sector as well across the greenhouse gas emissions sector as a notable regulation to come, despite the fact that eventually it never came to bear. And so what I do is, as part of my quasi-experiment or causal inference, is that my identification strategy, is to exploit that variation of the Clean Power Plan affecting the greenhouse gas emissions intensive sectors, and also the variation across firms itself of managerial capabilities. And I distinguish between just the binary decision of participation, as well as effort level, which again, as I showed you, CDP grades firms on varying levels of effort. Here are variables. I'm happy to discuss the quantitative analysis during Q&A. And here I just want to quickly show you that it really made a difference in terms of participation in carbon disclosures for the S&P 500 companies. This is as you can see, the green is greenhouse gas intensive companies, and the blue line is the greenhouse gas intensive companies. Those with managers, all firms participated at high levels. And in particular, during the Clean Power Plan era, companies, there was some strategic action there. So those in the greenhouse gas intensive sectors appear to have pulled back, those with managers, and those without. And that may have been because there, according to some business management scholars, if there's no good news to share, or it's not clear how it will be interpreted, companies might pull back. But interestingly, it turns out even for those who did participate, they indeed delivered on their greenhouse gas emissions intensity reductions. What we find is that overall, as a disclosing firm increases in size, it reduces carbon emissions on a per employee basis. So this is one measure of carbon emissions intensity. I have several measures, including measures denominated by revenue, by sales. And a lot of that reduction has been driven by greenhouse gas intensive firms, and they are reducing their greenhouse gas intensity even for those who just report to the CDP. They're not necessarily even showing that they are doing it at high efforts. So there is some strategic action there. So in my conversations with companies in the power sector and the utility sectors, for example, is that there were quite a lot of low-hanging fruits during this period, 2011 to 2020, where they were able to increase their efficiency and, as a result, show that they're able to reduce their carbon footprints. Interestingly, for consumer-oriented firms, there was some greenwashing or window dressing. Those who were reporting a lot of these sustainability outputs, from targets to even third-party audits on greenhouse gas emissions, for these lower carbon footprint companies, there were perverse results where their change in entity-wide emissions actually increased. And so this comes to the conclusion that A-list on the CDP, those who got grade A or B, were not exempt from greenwashing because the focus is on sustainability outputs. Walmart's, Target's, Nike, they were all in the B to A- range. They are part of industry-led Cascale. Some of you may know of this in the supply chain. It's called, or formally called, the Sustainable Apparel Coalition. And unfortunately, they had portrayed petroleum-based synthetics as more sustainable than some natural fiber. And Walmart itself was sued by the FTC at one point for misrepresenting what they call eco-friendly and sustainable products. So indeed, A-lists may not be exempt from greenwashing. I think that that means, though, it's important that when we look at ESG metrics, and so here I have ESG score as well as adjusted ESG score, and the adjusted ESG score takes into account political interference, anti-competitiveness, bad media related to greenwashing, for example. And I have these two series between 2011 and 2020, and as you see, the adjusted score is about 5 to 10 percentage points lower. Because of there are indeed these window dressing, greenwashing behavior going on, especially when there isn't regulatory pressure, as I showed earlier. The greenhouse gas emission intensive companies, while the CPP, the Clean Power Plan, never went into effect, the pressures that companies were feeling, especially when it came in a period where there were no other federal legislation, even if there were some things at the state level, but not at the federal level, and companies indeed took it seriously. So I'm going to end in the next couple of charts or slides. What I want to say is that well, all hands should be on deck, right? Accountability on firms greenwashing or political lobbying means that there needs to be better measures of actual corporate environmental behavior. The CDP disclosure scores are not quite up to standard. They're great for helping companies really practice climate disclosures. And in fact, many companies like Apple and Nike and others came out to support California's 2023 climate disclosure policies because they have been reporting to CDP. They know how to do it. Now we need to keep them accountable by making sure that we have measures and metrics on their actual corporate environmental behavior. And regulatory capture looks different now. Oil and gas companies continue to invest in new explorations and developments, as well as commit to emission goals for their operations and invest in clean tech. So since 2016, investments in clean energy have outpaced fossil fuels globally. And this continues even as we're seeing political headwinds. across in the US, but also across the globe. And this is certainly true where we're seeing clean energy investments far outpace that of fossil fuels, and the the oil and gas companies are major investors in clean tech. So indeed, regulatory capture or some of this it will look different today, and we need to take note of that. And stakeholder participation is key, including university students, fossil fuel disassociation movements across universities. And when I spent my sabbatical at Stanford during the inaugural year of the Doerr School of Sustainability, there was a big movement going on at that time, which I profile in chapter 10, the final chapter of my book. So please take a look. And so let me end by saying that the role of internal firm dynamics and their interplay with regulation in global governance has been examined, and it is really important to understand that corporate and governance can act together effectively. And I say governance broadly, both private governance and public governance, and private and public governance and global governance. So again, the bottom line is amid climate uncertainty, effective corporate responses emerge really from that combination of what's happening inside the firm managerial leadership, the smart use of complementary capabilities, and proactive approach to regulation and global governance. And so I will end there. Thank you so much. I have here a discount code if you want to get your own copy, or also I have an open access edition courtesy of MIT Press. And so here are the QR codes for both. Happy to answer questions, and comments are welcome as well.
Thank you very much, Lily. That was beautiful. Here's the rest of the tickets for the raffle. If anyone else is holding more tickets for the raffle, they go here, because we're going to conclude this Q&A session with a drawing to see who wins the book. Okay, questions? You want to give me your ticket, or do you want to ask a question, or both? Okay, I'll come and get that in a second. The floor is open to questions for Lily. Yes.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk today. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
I am particularly excited about this book, coffee. And I'm wondering, you mentioned like the piece with the summary or sharp today that leadership is one of the most important divergent factors in these organizations. When you look at who is transparent about their climate impacts and who is not. I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit more on what you mean by strong leadership, if there are particular yeah, my question.
Thank you. It's certainly, traits of a good leader. You can read about it like Harvard and others, the kind of business management literature. And I think the focus of this book is less about the personality or personal traits, but more about these kind of routines and structures at organizational designs and managerial designs within a firm. Because when there is an installation of these leaders and leadership is valued, they are then able to kind of be more sustained over a longer period of time. And so one sustainability officer can then hand it off to the next. And so I do focus on that. But at the same time, leaders have the capability of really helping to set the vision and also tell these narratives of how a company can go from less sustainable to more sustainable. And then they are able to build that governing coalition, which in order for it to be sustained over time, it also will have to be institutionalized. And so in many ways, in this book, I'm trying to bring together kind of that managerial agency with institutionalization at the firm level, as well as the regulation level, as well, and global governance as well. Thank you.
Another question?
Thank you so much for being able to speak with us. And I was wondering, in regards to the carbon disclosure project,
Yes.
who is creating the survey? I feel like that can also
Yes.
impact like what they're looking for and like the responses that they receive.
Yes, thank you for that question. So the Carbon Disclosure Project was first founded in around 2000, and it's an NGO based in London, and it's institutional investor driven. And so these annual climate change surveys, while it has changed over the past 20 years, the main structure has stayed the same, and it is institutional investors that are vetting these surveys, as well as other NGOs, and they do follow the various kind of international accounting standards, sustainability standards on these surveys.
One more question here from the audience, and then we have a question online.
Thank you so much for talking to us. I think this was really interesting. My name is Eli.
Thank you. Nice to meet you.
Nowadays, we have been hearing the word climate talks, and you have mentioned about the global regulatory pressures. And I think in the context of the US has been really the country that has pushed the investment with Article 6.2 of the Paris Agreement, buying carbon credits and helping companies, especially American companies, to buy credit. So I'm curious, how do you see this in the future, considering that there is a missing of those regulatory pressures that that supports the development of climate actions?
Yes. Thank you so much for your question, and very timely one. So this is how I think about it. So in my strategic management framework, I'm really talking about that multi-level governance. While I draw a lot of data from kind of the country level, within countries itself, there is that multi-level governance. And so increasingly, there is now turning to the state and local levels. I think the world should be less looking at what Trump is doing, President Trump, but more at what's happening at the state level, including California. As we know, in the last 2 weeks, California has just strengthened its cap and trade program. There were some concessions to kind of new oil and gas explorations or development in kind of central California, Central Coast. But that said, importantly, the strengthened carbon emissions trading program is important. It will have ramifications for linking these carbon markets, first with the Pacific Northwest, what's happening in Washington, up in Canada, all the way to the EU and even China. So I think the eyes should be on what's happening in California. And I personally think, and I know this is going to be on YouTube for years to come, is that I do think that what's happening with Trump, yes, that's happening because some companies are taking that into account and maybe even bullied into certain investments and actions. That at the same time, there is so much happening in California with the International Justice Courts ruled this summer in July that climate change is something that the world should take into account. We're going to see lawsuits across jurisdictions to come. And so those are forthcoming regulations. Companies, especially global businesses, that are not just looking at the next fiscal year, but several fiscal years down the line, they will look to that, to both what's happening at the global norms level, the advisory opinion by the IJC, as well as what's happening in California, the fourth largest economy in the world.
Okay, we have one more question
Yes.
from our online audience.
Alex says, your multi-level governance framework shows interactions among global, regulatory, and corporate levels. How do you see coordination evolving between these levels? For example, could it be coordinated better through leadership in a firm? And is there a role of AI?
Yes. Excellent question. Thank you so much. Yeah, I think that there could be coordination across both firm regulation and global governance. And these potentially independent associations can help make these connections, whether they are privately initiated or perhaps even at the local and state level. They could be that in the go-between, if you will, or the intermediary, and or even at the global governance level. What I'm seeing, what my kind of field observation when I was an observer at these various sustainability or privately initiated conferences is that I really see that interaction across all these levels, and that's where actually I think a lot of things are happening, where the rubber meets the road, if you will. So in fact, a lot of that exchange and facilitation is happening already. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. We're out of time, and would you like to do the drawing? Mix them all up. Everybody pay attention to the number on the ticket you're holding.
Right, let's see. Okay, so the lucky recipient is 008828. Yay! Come on down and receive your book.
Here's your book. And it's signed
Yay.
by the author.
May I have a photo with the lucky recipient?
Yeah, let's have a photo.
Yeah.
Good idea. I'll
Yeah.
take it.
Thank you. Oh, and actually, before everyone leaves, may I have a selfie with you, all of you?
Yeah.
That's a-
Grab this. Excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I hope you enjoy it.
I was really hoping.
Yeah. Before you all leave, can I have a selfie with you?
Yes.
Oh, wait, let's see.
If you'd like, I'll take you.
Oh,
Yeah, if you want to do a selfie, that's fine too.
should we do a selfie? I would like for you to be in it too. Okay, everyone turn around or turn towards me. I turn around. Let's see, can I get everyone? Thank you so much. Yeah.